But I just couldn't get to sleep. I felt cold, and it was in the middle of June, so it couldn't have been too cold out. But anyway, I finally started to doze off, and then some rocks probably around this size here come rolling down the cliff, something like that. And that's what woke me up. So I stood straight up in the sleeping bag, and I grabbed my shotgun, which was quite close, and my light. And I shone it up there, and the beam of the light hit the creature right in the face. So I grabbed the light and the handle of the gun, and I shot at the creature several times, and it seemed to back off. And dust would fly off his chest when the shot hit him. It acted as if I would come up and to shove you.
Just oomph type.
Yeah, just the pressure of the shot hitting seemed to shove him back some, but it had no real effect on him.
How do you describe what you saw standing on the top of that cliff?
Very awesome. Just huge and enormous and very ugly.
How big in the sense of the chest size or the arms and so on?
I would say his arms were as big around as my legs probably, and probably about 3.5, 4 feet across here. Very large.
And how tall?
Anywhere from 7 to 8 feet.
On the southern tip of Alaska's Kenai Peninsula, 16 miles from the nearest town, and reachable only by boat, sits the rotting skeleton of a settlement called Portlock. Moss climbs over collapsed cannery walls. Rusted machinery sits half-swallowed by the forest floor. No one has lived there since the early 1950s. Officially, it's one of hundreds of small Alaskan communities abandoned when the region's road network passed it by. Unofficially, for the people who trace their families back to it, Portlock is the place their ancestors fled, not because of geography, but because of something that lived in the woods. The town takes its name from a British sea captain, Nathaniel Portlock, who charted the bay in 1786. According to some retellings, his crew found the remains of an already abandoned native encampment on that first visit, and several of his men grew so uneasy, sick, unsettled, eager to leave, that they begged him to cut the survey short. No surviving record explains exactly what unsettled them. The bay, by some accounts, carried a reputation for wrongness from the very first page of its written history, decades before anyone called it Portlock at all. The settlement itself grew into a working community in the early 20th century around a salmon cannery populated largely by Sugpiaq and Russian Aleut families who had fished and hunted that stretch of coastline for generations before any cannery existed. A U.S. post office opened there in 1921, cementing Portlock as a real, mapped, functioning Alaskan fishing town. Nothing more, nothing less, at least on paper. Then the stories started. The earliest recorded strangeness, according to the oral history, passed down through descendant families, dates to just after the cannery opened. In 1905, by several accounts, every single native Alaskan worker employed there abruptly walked off the job and left town, citing only something in the surrounding woods. They stayed away for the better part of a year before quietly returning to work the following season, and no one who left ever gave a fuller explanation of what had driven them out. It's the kind of detail that resists easy dismissal precisely because it resists easy explanation too. No dramatic death, no monster sighting anyone wrote down, just an entire workforce that voted with its feet and never fully said why. From there, the stories accumulate through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in a steady, uneasy drumbeat. In the 1920s, rumors spread of something lurking near a mine outside town, alongside reports of trees found bent or damaged in ways loggers couldn't explain. By the 1930s, according to the versions of the legend collected decades later, a logger was said to have been killed by a single, devastating blow to the neck, an injury some locals insisted no bear could inflict. Gold prospectors who ventured into the surrounding hills reportedly stopped coming back. Moose and Dall sheep hunters told of freshly killed carcasses that vanished before they could return to claim them, as though something else had already taken possession of the kill. Deep in the timber, people described finding fallen trees that had been deliberately replanted upside down, roots pointing skyward, a detail that shows up again and again in Bigfoot and Sasquatch folklore across North America as an alleged territorial marker. And more than once, residents said a body would wash up in the lagoon, torn in ways that didn't match any animal attack anyone in town had ever seen. One resident, Tom Larson, is remembered in the oral history as having come face to face with the creature directly on the beach, though by his own account, he lost track of it after running for his rifle, a detail that has become almost a stock feature of cryptid encounter stories the world over. The witness who nearly gets proof and doesn't. The creature blamed for all of it came to be known as Nantinak, pronounced roughly Nantinak, a name most retellings translate as the one who steals people or those who steal people. Described as a massive bipedal, half-man, half-beast figure standing well over 7 feet tall and covered in dark hair, Nantinak was said to prowl the tree line at the edges of town. Elders reportedly warned children for decades to stay well clear of the lagoon and the forest after dark, and armed patrols and informal curfews are said to have become a fact of daily life in Portlock's later years, whether or not any of it was ever written down in an official log. By the versions of the story that circulated most widely, the fear became so constant and so total that by 1949 or 1950, the town's population picked up and left almost overnight, leaving only the postmaster behind until the post office itself finally closed its doors in 1950. Official tallies, where they exist at all, list around 15 people as having gone missing from the Portlock area during the years the legend covers. The Alutiiq oral tradition insists the true number was far higher, a discrepancy that either points to a folk legend inflating its own body count over generations of retelling, or to a remote, boat-only community where deaths in the wilderness simply never made it into any official record to begin with. That version of events sat quietly in regional folklore for decades, passed between families more than it was ever written down. Then, in 2009, a Homer Tribune article changed everything. It featured a detailed interview with Melania Helen Cale, believed to be one of the oldest living former residents connected to Portlock, who described the terror of Nantinak in vivid, specific detail, including, in a separate account from the same interview, a ghostly woman in a long black dress, so long she would drag it, reportedly seen drifting near the cliffs above the bay. Cale's testimony became the single most cited piece of evidence behind the modern legend, quoted and requoted across paranormal blogs and forums for over a decade, eventually forming the emotional backbone of a 2021 Discovery Plus series, Alaskan Killer Bigfoot. That show followed a 5-man team led by Portlock descendant Keith Seville on a 40-day expedition into the ruins, with the stated goal of confronting the creature and determining whether the town could ever be resettled. Before the men set off, one village elder is shown warning them plainly to stay away from the woods and the forest that had taken his ancestors, advice that, as more than one commentator has pointed out since, rather defeats the purpose of an expedition built entirely around going into those woods. There's a detail buried in the linguistics of the story that few of the retellings mention, and that cuts directly directly against the legend's oldest claims. Researchers looking into the name itself have pointed out that Nantinak doesn't actually come from the Sugpiaq or Alutiiq language traditionally spoken in and around Portlock at all. It appears instead to be borrowed from Dena'ina, a related but distinct indigenous language, where a similar-sounding word refers to a folkloric bogeyman figure used to frighten children into behaving, not a physical predator stalking the woods. The Sugpiaq people, notably, already have their own distinct word for a Bigfoot-like being, Arularak, raising an uncomfortable question for anyone treating the Nantinak name as ancient, untouched oral tradition. If the word itself was borrowed relatively recently from a neighboring culture's bogeyman story, how much of the rest of the legend was assembled the same way, one borrowed piece at a time? Here is where the story takes its strangest turn. Not in the forest, but in a follow-up interview almost nobody saw coming. In April of 2021, a journalist investigating the legend's origins tracked down Sally Ash, the relative who had actually translated Melania Cale's original 2009 testimony for the Homer Tribune. What Ash revealed in that follow-up interview upended the foundation the entire modern legend had been quietly resting on for over a decade. According to her account, Cale had simply grown exhausted of being asked over and over whether the Bigfoot killing story was true, and had essentially invented, on the spot, an elaborate account of a murderous creature stalking Portlock, mostly just to make the questions stop. Ash described sitting in the room at the time with her sisters and cousins, all of them younger than Cale, all of them fully aware in real time that the story wasn't true, and none of them willing to contradict an elder in front of others, a cultural dynamic Ash described plainly. They simply weren't raised in a way that allowed them to tell an elder she was wrong. By Ash's account, everyone present understood the story was fabricated, quietly shared a laugh about it with Cale afterward, and then watched it get repeated, published, and eventually broadcast to a national audience as the definitive origin story of Portlock's abandonment. It's a genuinely rare thing in the world of unexplained phenomena, not a debunking built on speculation or statistical improbability, but a direct, on-record account from someone who says she was in the room when the legend's central piece of evidence was invented. That single admission does not erase everything connected to Portlock's folklore. Ash herself maintained that she still believed some kind of Bigfoot-like creature genuinely existed in the surrounding wilderness, citing her own family's older stories and her brother's account of a frightening, foul-smelling encounter, and separately, extensive searches of Alaskan newspaper archives from the 1930s and 1940s have turned up no record at all of the murders, disappearances, or monster attacks central to the legend, a silence that skeptics say is damning, and that some locals argue simply reflects how easily a death in a remote, boat-access-only village could go unrecorded in that era. What historical records do show, consistently and without much room for dispute, is a far less supernatural explanation for Portlock's abandonment. After the completion of the Sterling Highway connected other Kenai Peninsula communities to Alaska's broader road network in the 1940s, boat-only settlements like Portlock became steadily less and less viable. There was no highway access, no reliable pipeline for schooling, no easy path to the region's growing economic centers. Families followed opportunity to more accessible towns like Nanwalek and Seldovia, the same way small, isolated communities have quietly emptied out all across rural America for a century. Keith Seville, the Portlock descendant who led the 2021 Discovery Plus expedition and who describes himself as more skeptic than believer, even after 40 days in those woods, has said plainly that according to what he understood from his own family, people didn't leave Portlock because of killings. They left because of the economy, the schools, and the church. There was, in his words, no actual killing of people behind the move, and yet Seville is also on record saying that his time in Portlock left him with something he can't fully explain, an unshakable sense, built over 40 days of living in that specific patch of forest, that there really is something out there, even if he can't prove what. That's the strange needle this story keeps threading. Descendants who reject the killer Bigfoot narrative as their family's actual reason for leaving, while still, separately, describing an unmistakable wrongness in those woods that they're not eager to dismiss. So, which version is true? A folklore tradition rooted in generations of a diffuse, hard-to-name unease about a specific stretch of coastline, later crystallized, almost by accident, into a single dramatic killer Bigfoot narrative by one elder's tired, off-the-cuff answer that nobody around her had the standing to correct, or a real, unrecorded pattern of disappearances in a place so remote that an entire town could quietly lose people to the wilderness for decades without a single newspaper ever printing a word about it. A pattern that simply happened to align conveniently with the collapse of a fishing economy nobody particularly wanted to blame for the exodus instead. Portlock still stands today, empty, moss-covered, reachable only by boat, its cannery rusting into the tide line. People still travel out to it, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever the Sugpiaq oral tradition calls Arularak and the modern legend calls Nantinak. Whether they're chasing a myth born from one grandmother's tired answer to a question she was sick of hearing, or something that has simply gotten very good across more than a century at staying just outside the reach of the historical record, is a question no one, not the elders, not the linguists, not the journalists, not the 5 men who spent 40 days in that forest on camera, has ever definitively answered. What do you think really emptied out Portlock, Alaska? And if it really was just one story told by one exhausted woman to make people stop asking, why does a self-described skeptic who spent 40 days living in those exact woods still say there's something out there he can't explain? There is a real, declassified government memo sitting today in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. that legally required mountaineers to hand over any Yeti they found, dead or alive, directly to a foreign government and explicitly forbade them from telling a single reporter. That's not a theory. That's the actual, surviving paper. Here's how we got there. The word Yeti has existed in Himalayan culture for centuries, long before any Western climber ever set foot near Everest. Sherpa, Tibetan, and Bhutanese oral tradition described a wild, powerful being of the high snow line, not folklore performed for tourists, but a genuine, deeply held part of regional cosmology, referenced in monastery teachings generations before anyone in London or New York had ever heard the word. The West got the name wrong almost immediately, and in exactly the way that made it unforgettable. In 1921, during a British reconnaissance expedition toward Everest, climbers relayed a local term, something close to Meto Kangmi, back to a journalist named Henry Newman. Newman didn't translate it carefully. He translated it luridly for headlines, and Abominable Snowman was born, a mistranslation so much catchier creepier than the original that it permanently overwrote it in the Western imagination. 30 years later, the story stopped being folklore and started being physical evidence. November 1951. Mountaineer Eric Shipton and his colleague, Dr. Michael Ward, are on a reconnaissance expedition near the Menlung Glacier, scouting an alternate route to Everest, when they come across a line of tracks pressed into hardened snow at roughly 18,000 feet. Not a single print. A trail clear enough that Shipton could see exactly where the creature had jumped a 3-foot crevasse, exactly where its toes had dug into the landing side for traction, exactly where the tracks of what appeared to be 2 separate creatures ran side by side before crossing paths and diverging again. Their Sherpa porters didn't hesitate for a second when they saw the marks. "Yeti, sir, Yeti," they said immediately, with no prompting. Shipton photographed it, placed an ice axe next to the clearest print for scale. The image is sharp, not blurry, not distant, not degraded by decades of copying. A clean, close photograph of a footprint roughly 12 to 13 inches long, nearly twice the width of Shipton's own boot, with what looked unmistakably like an opposable big toe and 3 smaller toes trailing beside it. The snow had been firm enough that primatologists studying the photo decades later described it as looking almost like a plaster cast rather than an ordinary snow impression. Unusually sharp-edged, unusually well-preserved detail for a print left in open terrain. Shipton wasn't some fame-hungry amateur looking to cash in on a story. He was one of the most respected Himalayan mountaineers alive, a serious professional whose credibility on matters of the mountains was considered essentially unimpeachable by his peers. When his photograph reached the world, nobody accused him of faking it. They just couldn't explain it. In the decades since, more than 50 separate mountaineers and naturalists, including major respected names in Himalayan climbing history, have reported finding similar tracks of their own, none of them ever definitively traced to any single known animal at the time of discovery. 1 year later, it happened again, to an even bigger name. Edmund Hillary, the man who would become the first person to summit Everest, wrote in 1952 that he'd personally recovered a tuft of long, coarse black hair at 19,000 feet, in terrain he described as difficult enough that whatever left it behind was, in his own words, no mean rock climber. Hillary would go on to lead his own dedicated Yeti hunting expedition in later years. His results were inconclusive, but the fact that the first man to conquer Everest thought the question was worth a dedicated expedition tells you how seriously this had already become inside the mountaineering world by the early 1950s. Then came the monasteries. High in the Kumjung region of Nepal, Buddhist monks had preserved what they described as a genuine Yeti scalp, a conical, leathery relic roughly the size of a large bowl, marked with coarse black and reddish hair, kept as a sacred object in the village monastery and shown on rare occasions to select visiting Westerners as physical proof of what their tradition had always described. Sir Edmund Hillary himself was permitted to examine the relic during one of his later expeditions, and even arranged to have a sample flown out for scientific testing at the time, an early, less conclusive round of analysis that failed to settle the question one way or the other with the cruder lab techniques available in that era. For years afterward, the scalp sat at the center of the mystery, an actual physical artifact, not a photograph, not a story, guarded by religious authorities who had no obvious financial incentive to lie about what it was, treated by the monastery with the same reverence as any other sacred relic in its care. By the mid-1950s, this had stopped being a curiosity and started being an international operation. In 1954, Britain's Daily Mail newspaper funded a 16-week snowman expedition specifically to search Everest for hard proof. proof. Later in the decade, American oil millionaire Tom Slick, a wealthy, well-connected Texas businessman with a long-standing personal fascination with unexplained animals, personally bankrolled multiple Himalayan expeditions dedicated entirely to finding the creature, spending a fortune most people at the time considered completely irrational for a cryptozoology hunt. And then, in 1959, two actual governments got officially, formally, bureaucratically involved. And this is the part of the story that turns a monster legend into something you can actually go verify with your own eyes. On November 30th, 1959, the American Embassy in Kathmandu sent a memo back to the U.S. State Department. Its title, Regulations Governing Mountain Climbing Expeditions in Nepal, Relating to Yeti. Read that title again. Not a joke, not satire, an official diplomatic communication between two governments, with the word Yeti typed directly into the header of a serious foreign policy document filed alongside genuine Cold War-era diplomatic correspondence, eventually preserved permanently by the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration. It sat quietly in government storage for decades before finally going on public display in Washington, D.C. in the fall of 2017. An actual physical artifact anyone could walk up and read for themselves. The regulations, originally issued by the government of Nepal 2 years earlier, in 1957, laid out 3 specific rules for anyone attempting to search for the creature. First, pay the Nepalese government a royalty of 5,000 rupees, several $100s at the time, a serious sum for the era, just for the legal right to look. Second, if the Yeti was found, it could be photographed or captured alive, but under no circumstances killed, except in a genuine emergency of self-defense. Third, and this is the part that should stop you cold, any photographs and the creature itself, dead or alive, had to be surrendered immediately to the government of Nepal, and any information about a confirmed sighting was explicitly barred from going to the press. The memo's own language is direct. News of the Yeti's existence must not in any way be given out to the press or reporters for publicity. Sit with that specific clause for a second. Not share your findings for scientific review. Not notify the appropriate wildlife authority. A direct written instruction that if you found proof of one of the most sought-after undiscovered animals on Earth, you were legally required to hand it over quietly to the government and keep the press out of it entirely. Believers have pointed to that exact clause for decades as the single strongest piece of institutional evidence in the entire Yeti mystery. Not a blurry photo, not an eyewitness account, but an actual government's own written policy, treating the possibility of contact seriously enough to legislate silence around it in advance. Why write a mandatory press blackout clause into a real diplomatic memo unless there was a real, anticipated scenario where someone might actually find something worth hiding? Historians who've studied the memo's full context have offered a more grounded explanation, and it's worth hearing in full before drawing a conclusion. Nepal, in the late 1950s, occupied an extremely delicate geopolitical position, a small, newly internationally engaged buffer state sitting directly between two nuclear-adjacent regional powers the U.S. was actively worried about, India and a newly communist China, with Soviet influence pushing into the region from multiple directions at once. The American embassy in Kathmandu itself had only just opened that same year, a fresh diplomatic foothold in a country whose sovereignty the U.S. had every strategic reason to publicly respect and reinforce. Some researchers argue the real function of the memo had almost nothing to do with genuine cryptozoological concern, and everything to do with a young U.S. embassy demonstrating diplomatic respect for Nepalese sovereignty over its own resources and narrative, the same instinct that would lead any government to regulate valuable natural resources or politically sensitive discoveries on its own soil, whether the resource in question was oil, minerals, or, in this admittedly bizarre case, an internationally famous cryptid. There's an added layer that fringe researchers have never fully let go of. Tom Slick, the Texas oil millionaire, personally bankrolling multiple Himalayan expeditions during this exact period, has long been the subject of persistent, unverified speculation about informal ties to American intelligence circles during the Cold War. Claims that Slick's genuine personal obsession with cryptozoology may have doubled as convenient cover for reconnaissance activity along a sensitive Himalayan border region abutting both Chinese-controlled Tibet and India. No declassified document has ever definitively confirmed Slick operated as an actual intelligence asset, and mainstream historians generally treat his Yeti expeditions as exactly what they appeared to be: the extravagant hobby of a genuinely wealthy, genuinely eccentric enthusiast. But the fact that a private American oil fortune was funding repeated expeditions into a remote, strategically sensitive mountain border zone during the height of the Cold War, at almost the exact same moment two governments were quietly drafting official policy on what to do if evidence turned up, is exactly the kind of overlapping detail that keeps this particular conspiracy theory from ever fully going away. Both explanations can be true at once, and that's exactly what makes this case different from almost every other cryptid story on Earth. It's the rare instance where the government is hiding something isn't a theory extrapolated from silence and rumor. It's a real, physical, dated, signed piece of official government correspondence that says, in writing, hand it over and don't tell the press, regardless of which motive actually sat behind the words. The hunt didn't stop after 1959. It just kept generating more physical evidence that kept refusing to resolve cleanly in either direction. Primatologist John Napier, one of the most credentialed scientists to ever take the Shipton footprint seriously, spent years examining the case at the request of both governmental and academic bodies, eventually donating his own plaster cast of the print to a major university bioanthropology collection, where it remains cataloged and available for study to this day. In his personal notes, later uncovered by researchers, Napier privately speculated that by the time Shipton's photograph was taken, the original print had likely already begun melting and distorting in the sun, meaning the single most famous piece of physical Yeti evidence on Earth might not even be a clean, original impression, but a warped, half-thawed version of whatever actually made it, stretched by hours of sun exposure into a shape more dramatic than the animal's actual foot. That detail rarely makes it into the popular retelling, and it's exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous correction that tends to get lost the further a story travels from the scientist who actually examined the evidence firsthand. Explorer Daniel Taylor spent over 60 years of his life chasing the same question, following it from childhood curiosity all the way through a full academic and conservation career, eventually using his research to help establish an entire national park in the Nepalese Himalayas, dedicated partly to protecting the terrain where Yeti sightings concentrated most heavily. His own conclusion, after 6 decades in the field, pointed toward a bear, specifically a Himalayan species capable of walking on its hind legs for short stretches, leaving a track that, once melted and refrozen in variable snow conditions, could plausibly stretch and distort into something resembling an elongated human-like footprint with what looks like an opposable toe. Taylor has said publicly that he considers the search itself and the conservation legacy it produced more valuable than whatever literal answer he eventually landed on. A park now permanently protecting real, endangered Himalayan Himalayan wildlife that might never have been set aside at all if not for decades of Yeti-driven curiosity funding the surveys that first mapped the region. Modern genetics finally gave the mystery its most rigorous test yet, and it came from two completely independent research teams working years apart. In 2014, Oxford geneticist Brian Sykes analyzed hair samples submitted by believers and collectors from across the region, expecting, like most researchers, to find dogs, bears, or other known animals. What he found instead was stranger than a simple bear misidentification: DNA that matched most closely to an ancient extinct species of polar bear, suggesting a previously unknown, unstudied bear lineage still living in the Himalayas. Not proof of a Yeti, but proof that the region was still hiding real, undocumented biology inside animals nobody had bothered studying closely. A genuine scientific surprise that made international headlines in its own right, independent of any cryptid connection. In 2017, a second, more extensive team, led by evolutionary biologist Charlotte Lindqvist, tested a broader set of samples, including hair, bone, skin, and even the Kumjung Monastery's own guarded scalp relic, the same sacred object monks had preserved and shown to visiting Westerners for generations as physical proof of their tradition's oldest stories. Their conclusion, published in the peer-reviewed journal Proceedings of the Royal Society B, every single sample tested, without exception, matched known Himalayan brown bears, Tibetan brown bears, or Asian black bears, including the sacred scalp itself, identified as fashioned from the hide of a siro, a goat-like mountain animal entirely unrelated to any primate. One additional sample, from a hair reportedly collected by a Jesuit priest who claimed to have personally spotted a Yeti in the 1950s, was tested separately for a televised documentary and came back once again as ordinary Tibetan brown bear. Mountaineer Reinhold Messner, the same legendary climber who declined to attempt Mount Kailash out of respect for its sanctity, spent years personally investigating Yeti reports across multiple Himalayan expeditions and reached his own firm conclusion decades before the DNA studies existed. The Yeti, in his professional assessment, was almost certainly a Tibetan brown bear, an animal genuinely rare, genuinely elusive, and genuinely capable of standing upright on its hind legs for short bursts when threatened or curious, exactly long enough to leave behind the kind of track that could be misread by an exhausted climber at extreme altitude in thin air, under conditions where human perception is already scientifically documented to become unreliable. So here's where that leaves you. Every individual piece of hard physical evidence, the scalp, the hair samples, the modern DNA, has, without a single exception, traced back to a known terrestrial bear species. Not one confirmed biological sample has ever pointed toward an unknown primate, a surviving hominid, or anything genuinely outside the boundaries of known Himalayan wildlife. That's about as close to a real scientific verdict as cryptozoology ever gets, and it's more conclusive than almost any other cryptid case examined in this much detail anywhere in the world. And yet none of that explains why two actual governments, in a real, surviving, dated diplomatic document, felt the specific need to write down, in official language, that any physical evidence of the creature had to be quietly surrendered to authorities and kept out of the newspapers. A government doesn't usually bother legislating silence around something it's already certain doesn't exist. Whether that clause was written to manage a delicate Cold War alliance, to keep a wealthy oil tycoon's border activities quiet, or to manage something else entirely, is a question the declassified paperwork answers only halfway and leaves the rest exactly where it sat for over 65 years, unresolved, on file, and available for anyone willing to go read it themselves at the National Archives, sitting in plain sight, waiting for for someone to ask the right question about why it was ever written at all.
Size of the track with the amount of weight over one small part of it. A biomechanical foot, and there's anthropology studies in scientific journals that talk about this.
You're looking at, we're about almost 20 kilometers up Harrison Lake, at the 20-mile point actually.
The first thing that convinced me was back in 1970 when I saw and studied a pair of footprint casts from up in the north.
My name is John Green, and I've been studying Sasquatch since 1957.
6 days. That's how long a Canadian prospector swore under a signed legal affidavit that he was held captive by a family of Sasquatch in the mountains of British Columbia. Not a campfire story, not a blurry photo, a notarized statement. And to this day, no Canadian government agency has ever opened a file on it. Here's what actually happened. In the summer of 1924, a logger and part-time prospector named Albert Ostman set out alone for the head of Toba Inlet, a remote fjord north of Vancouver, chasing rumors of a lost gold claim. The indigenous guide who ferried him out warned him the last man who searched that inlet for gold was reportedly killed by something local hunters wouldn't name. Ostman laughed it off. He shouldn't have. For several nights straight, Ostman woke to find his supplies disturbed, food missing, gear moved. On what he'd later describe as his final night before planning to break camp, he fell asleep in his sleeping bag, boots on, rifle within reach. He woke up already moving. Inside the bag, being carried at speed through the forest for what he estimated was hours. He could feel the creature's shoulder under him with every step. He couldn't reach his rifle. He couldn't see anything but canvas and darkness. All he could do was count the time in his head and wait. When he was finally dumped out, Ostman found himself staring at 4 Sasquatch, an elderly male, an adult female, and 2 younger ones, watching him with what he described as calm, almost human curiosity. Not aggression, curiosity. He spent the next 6 days in their company, close enough to study their behavior, their diet, even their improvised tools, and he says the family showed no interest in harming him at all. He watched them forage. He watched the younger ones interact with what looked like simple curiosity toward him. An outsider dropped into their world with no explanation. He eventually escaped, he claimed, by offering the older male a pinch of snuff tobacco that sent the creature into a violent coughing fit long enough for Ostman to run, grabbing what gear he could reach and not looking back until he'd put real distance between himself and the camp. He told almost no one for over 3 decades. Not out of drama, out of fear that a story this specific, this strange, would end his credibility permanently in a small logging community where reputation was everything. In 1957, Ostman finally signed a formal, notarized affidavit describing the encounter in exhaustive physical detail: height, build, hair color, even the texture of their skin beneath the hair. Researcher John Green, who would go on to become Canada's foremost Sasquatch investigator, interviewed Ostman personally and came away convinced the man wasn't lying. Whatever had actually happened to him out there, Ostman never asked for money, never sold his story to a tabloid, never wavered on a single detail for the rest of his life. In 1957, Ostman finally signed a formal, notarized affidavit describing the encounter in exhaustive physical detail: height, build, hair color, even the texture of their skin beneath the hair. Researcher John Green, who would go on to become Canada's foremost Sasquatch investigator, interviewed Ostman personally and came away convinced the man wasn't lying whatever had actually happened to him out there. Ostman never asked for money, never sold his story to a tabloid, never wavered on a single detail for the rest of his life. Green wasn't some fringe enthusiast looking for attention either. He was a respected small-town newspaper man, later the actual mayor of Harrison Hot Springs, British Columbia, the kind of publicly accountable, community-trusted figure who had every reason to protect his own reputation rather than risk it chasing folklore. He spent over 50 years cataloging sightings, interviewing witnesses, and casting footprints, right up until his death in 2011. If Ostman's story was a con, it fooled one of the most methodical, skeptical investigators to ever take the subject seriously. That's strike one against the easy dismissal. Now here's strike two. 17 years before Ostman went public, a family was already living this nightmare in daylight in front of witnesses less than 200 kilometers away. September 1941, Ruby Creek, British Columbia. The Chapman family, Jeannie Chapman and her children, were home alone when her eldest son came running, insisting something enormous was coming out of the tree line. Jeannie stepped outside expecting a bear. What she saw was 7 to 8 feet tall, broad enough across the shoulders to block the light behind it, walking upright on 2 legs, like a person. It was working its way steadily closer, unhurried, like it had all the time in the world and knew exactly where it was going. She didn't stop to study it. She grabbed her children, threw a blanket over them to keep them from looking back, and ran down to the nearby village as fast as she could move, convinced the creature was coming for her kids specifically. She'd later say she wasn't running from fear of what it looked like. She was running because of how deliberately it kept coming. When the family returned home later with help, the house was untouched, but the outhouse wasn't. The creature had broken it open and gone straight for a 55-gallon barrel of salted fish inside, smashed it open like it knew exactly what was in it, and left the rest of the property completely alone. Whatever it wanted specifically, and it didn't waste time looking anywhere else. Investigators who later checked the property found a single footprint measuring roughly 17 inches, sunk deep enough into solid ground to suggest serious weight behind it. No one in 1941 was chasing fame off a Bigfoot story. There was no Bigfoot story yet. The word Sasquatch itself had only been coined 12 years earlier by a Canadian Indian agent named J.W. Burns, translating a term used for generations by the Steet Sales First Nation to describe something they'd always known was out there, long before any white settler gave it a catchy name for the tabloids. 2 separate incidents, decades apart, no connection to each other, both eventually landing on the desk of the same man, John Green. Now here's where it gets stranger, and where the conspiracy angle stops being speculation and starts being documented fact. October 1955, a highway worker named William Rowe is hiking alone near Tate John Cache, British Columbia, roughly 80 miles from Jasper, Alberta. In broad daylight, he watches a creature emerge from the brush less than 100 feet away and just graze, like an animal settling in for a meal. No hesitation, no fear. It didn't know he was there yet. He had minutes to study it, not seconds. Minutes. Female, by his account, with visible physical development consistent with that assessment. Silver-tipped brown hair, a sloped forehead unlike anything he'd seen on a bear, an ape, or a person. Rowe would later swear, under his own signed affidavit, that the animal showed no tool use, no aggression, nothing but calm, unhurried foraging, right up until the wind shifted. It caught his scent, and it was gone into the tree line. Before he could even raise his camera, he filed his own sworn statement within days, while the memory was still sharp, rather than waiting decades like Ostman had. 2 witnesses, 2 different decades, 2 formal signed affidavits, given under their own names, with nothing to gain and, in a small working community, plenty of ridicule to lose. 3 separate witnesses now, 3 separate decades, a growing pile of physical evidence, footprint casts, broken structures, matching physical descriptions from people who never met each other, sitting almost entirely in the hands of private citizens and independent researchers, because virtually no government body in Canada has ever formally picked it up. That's not an accident. That's the actual, documented pattern. British Columbia's forests are also the backbone of one of Canada's largest industries, logging. Millions of hectares of exactly the kind of remote, old-growth terrain where every one of these encounters took place are simultaneously some of the most valuable timber and resource land in the country. A formally recognized, protected, endangered species living in that exact terrain would trigger environmental review requirements that could freeze logging operations across huge sections of the province. The same kind of regulatory freeze that's happened for other threatened species in British Columbia's history, from the spotted owl to old-growth dependent caribou herds, both of which have already forced real, multi-year logging shutdowns in specific regions once their protected status was confirmed. Skeptics call the absence of investigation coincidence. Believers call it motive. Either way, it's a real, provable fact. No Canadian federal or provincial agency has ever funded, authorized, or published an official investigation into Sasquatch reports, despite British Columbia alone accounting for more documented sightings than almost anywhere else on the continent. Think about what that would actually mean if it were confirmed tomorrow. Every active logging permit inside a designated Sasquatch habitat zone, every planned road, every clear cut, every resource extraction contract, suddenly subject to the same environmental review process that's already slowed or halted other projects over species with a fraction of the physical evidence trail Sasquatch has accumulated. For an industry worth billions of dollars annually to the provincial economy, that's not an abstract inconvenience. That's the kind of finding a government agency would have every practical incentive to simply never go looking for in the first place, not because of some sweeping cover-up memo, but because nobody with budget authority wants to be the one who opens the file that could cost the province its logging revenue. Compare that to how seriously other unexplained wildlife claims get treated. When a new, unconfirmed species of frog or beetle turns up in a remote BC valley, government biologists mobilize, funding appears, survey teams go in within a season. For the single most consistently reported large-bodied cryptid on the entire continent, nothing. Not a denial, not an investigation, just silence. For over 100 years of accumulating testimony. History has actually done this before, and it's worth remembering exactly how recently. The mountain gorilla wasn't confirmed to Western science until 1902, dismissed for decades before that as exaggerated native folklore about giant ape men in the African forest. The okapi, a genuinely bizarre striped relative of the giraffe, was considered a tall tale by European naturalists until a skin and skull were finally produced in 1901. Local hunters and indigenous communities in both cases had known exactly what they were describing the entire time. It took Western institutional science literally centuries, in some cases, to catch up to testimony that had been consistent and specific from the very beginning. That's not proof Sasquatch is next on that list. It's proof that no scientist has confirmed it yet, and it definitely isn't real are two very different claims, and history has punished people for confusing them before. Here's the detail that should bother you the most. Anthropologist Grover Krantz, one of the only credentialed academics in North America who took the physical evidence seriously enough to build part of his career around it, spent decades petitioning for the Sasquatch to receive formal scientific, taxonomic consideration. Not confirmation, just consideration. The same basic scientific process used for every other cryptid animal claim that's eventually been proven real, from the mountain gorilla to the giant squid, both of which were once dismissed exactly the same way Sasquatch is dismissed now. He published peer-reviewed anatomical analysis of footprint casts, arguing the dermal ridge patterns and weight distribution characteristics were extraordinarily difficult to fake convincingly with 1970s-era hoaxing techniques. He was functionally ignored by the mainstream academic establishment for the rest of his career anyway. He died in 2002, still waiting for anyone with real institutional authority to simply look at the evidence and say yes or no. The petition never went anywhere. Meanwhile, the physical evidence kept piling up in exactly the same region, decade after decade. Multiple 1970s Fraser Valley track finds, a 1990 17-inch footprint discovery on Sandspit's shoreline, found alongside heavy logging equipment that had been disturbed repeatedly over several visits. A 1991 Fort Nelson witness who compared fresh tracks directly against his own boot size on the spot and photographed the difference before it could wash away in the mud. A separate 1991 hiker's discovery of deliberately arranged teepee-style limb formations, followed by vocalizations recorded from the same clearing days later. None of it centrally cataloged by any government scientific body. All of it scattered across private researchers' personal files, van trunks, and garages. The actual physical evidence trail of Canada's most persistent unexplained phenomenon, sitting in cardboard boxes instead of a national research lab, gathering dust instead of funding. So ask yourself the question this story keeps circling back to. Is the total, complete absence of any official Canadian government investigation into 100 years of consistent, cross-decade, sworn eyewitness testimony really just bureaucratic indifference to an unproven folk legend? Or is it exactly what you'd expect if formally acknowledging what's actually out there in those forests came with consequences no logging-dependent provincial economy could afford to trigger? Here's the last thing to sit with. In over a century of reported encounters across British Columbia and beyond, not one has ever ended with a body, a bone, or a scrap of hard biological tissue recovered and verified. Skeptics say that silence alone should settle it. Believers point out that black bears, wolverines, and other genuinely reclusive wilderness animals go entire human lifetimes in the same terrain without leaving behind a single accidentally discovered carcass either. Proof, they argue, of nothing more than how good the deep Canadian wilderness still is at keeping its own secrets, animal or otherwise. Albert Ostman never changed his story, right up until his death. Jeannie Chapman never changed hers. William Rowe never changed his. 3 different decades, 3 different regions of British Columbia. 0 contact with each other. 0 chance to coordinate a shared lie. And nearly 70 years after the last of those 3 affidavits was signed, not one Canadian government agency has ever officially opened a file to find out why.